Dear learners, welcome back to Learn English Through True Stories, where English learning becomes an unforgettable adventure. Today's story is not just about a man, it's about a mission, a language, and a legacy that shaped the future of an entire people. You are about to meet Alexandre de Rhodes, a French Jesuit missionary who traveled across continents, facing exile, disease, and cultural barriers. Yet, through it all, he never gave up on his dream to bring faith, knowledge, and language to a distant land. He didn't carry weapons. He didn't command armies. But what he carried instead was a powerful idea that words, written and spoken, can transform a nation. That idea would change Vietnam forever. This is not just a story of one man's faith. It's about how language builds bridges between worlds. It's about resilience in the face of rejection, and about courage, not the loud kind, but the quiet, stubborn kind that endures. As you listen, you'll improve your English listening and vocabulary. But more than that, you'll be inspired by the power of vision and purpose. By the end, you'll see how one person, even without political power, can plant seeds that grow for centuries. So, get ready for a journey across oceans and time, a journey of passion, exile, and triumph. This is the story of the man who gave Vietnam its written voice. And if you'd like to support our work, you're welcome to like, comment, share, or join us. Your support helps us keep creating meaningful content for you. Let's begin. In the year 1591, Alexandre de Rhodes was born in the ancient city of Avignon, a place then ruled by the papacy, not France. From the moment of his birth, his world was filled with the sounds of Latin prayers and the strict rhythm of religious life. His family was not noble, but they were devout. The church was not just a place of worship, it was the heart of society, the path to knowledge, and the doorway to distant lands. Europe in the early 17th century was a land of both faith and fire. It was the time of exploration, of bold voyages across uncharted seas, but also of religious conflict. The Protestant Reformation had torn Christianity apart, and the Catholic Church was struggling to regain its influence. One of its strongest answers was the Jesuit order, an elite group of scholar priests trained to teach, defend, and spread the Catholic faith around the globe. Young Alexander was drawn to this mission. From an early age, he was fascinated by languages and cultures beyond Europe. He entered the Jesuit order in Rome, where he spent years in intense study of philosophy, theology, mathematics, and most of all, languages. Jesuits believed that to convert people, you must first understand them. To preach to the heart, you must first learn their voice. It was in Rome that Alexander first heard of the Far East, of mysterious lands like China, Japan, and Tonkin, northern Vietnam. The Jesuits had already established missions in Macau and other parts of Asia, but the work was difficult. Cultures were vastly different, rulers were suspicious, and the journey itself was deadly. Yet Alexander felt no fear. To him, the call of faith was louder than the threat of disease or death. In 1619, at the age of 28, he was finally given permission to go. His destination, the Vietnamese kingdom of Dang Nguyen, ruled by the powerful Trinh lords. At that time, Vietnam was a land divided, split between northern and southern dynasties, yet full of life, history, and complexity. Few Europeans had ever seen it. Fewer still had tried to learn its language or understand its people. But Alexandre de Rhodes was determined to do both. What drives a person to leave everything behind, their home, family, and even country, for a distant land they've never seen? Was it faith, curiosity, or something deeper, a longing to belong to something greater than oneself? He didn't know it then, but he was about to begin a journey that would not only test his endurance but redefine the Vietnamese language itself. But before his mission could begin, the journey to Asia would test him in ways he never expected. The sea voyage from Europe to Asia was not a peaceful pilgrimage. It was a perilous ordeal, long, slow, and filled with danger. Alexandre de Rhodes boarded a Portuguese ship from Lisbon, a journey that would take more than a year. Along the way, he battled seasickness, storms, hunger, and the ever-present threat of disease. Ships were often cramped and dirty, and many did not survive the voyage. But de Rhodes did. His spirit remained unshaken. His mission gave him strength. After months at sea, he arrived in the Portuguese colony of Goa, in India, then moved to Macau, the Jesuit base for East Asia. There, he spent time learning the local languages and waiting for permission to enter Vietnam. Foreigners were often viewed with suspicion, and the Trinh rulers of northern Vietnam were wary of outside influence. Catholic missionaries had to move with care. Preaching openly could lead to arrest, or worse. Finally, in 1627, de Rhodes was allowed to travel to Dang Nguai, northern Vietnam. He was welcomed cautiously but allowed to work under close watch. And this is where his greatest challenge began, not from the government, but from the language. Vietnamese was unlike anything he had ever encountered. It was tonal, rich in nuance, and written in a complex script based on Chinese characters, called Chu Nam. Learning to speak it was hard enough, but reading and writing it required years of study. For most missionaries, it was a barrier too high to cross. But Alexandre de Rhodes did not give up. He believed that to spread Christianity in Vietnam, the people had to hear the gospel in their own language, not in Latin, not in Chinese, but in Vietnamese, spoken simply and clearly. And not just spoken. He wanted the Vietnamese to read, write, and own their faith. This meant more than just learning the language. It meant building a system for others to learn it, too. De Rhodes realized that the existing Chu Nam script was too difficult to use for mass teaching, especially among poor villagers. He began developing a new writing system, based on the Latin alphabet used in European languages. But how do you turn a tonal, complex language into Roman letters, and still preserve its sound, rhythm, and meaning? This was his challenge. One that would take years of careful listening, trial and error, and collaboration with local converts and scholars. With no formal linguistic tools, he had to create his own rules, based on sound, pronunciation, and logic. He began compiling what would later become the first Vietnamese, Portuguese, Latin dictionary. Every word was a puzzle. Every phrase, a test of precision and respect. Mistakes could change meanings. Misinterpretations could offend. But slowly, patiently, he crafted a new way to write Vietnamese, a tool that would one day belong to the people. Still, there was resistance. Some Vietnamese elites saw the new alphabet as a foreign intrusion. Others questioned the motives behind it. Even within the Catholic Church, some viewed his project with doubt. Was he simplifying the language too much? Was he dishonoring tradition? And yet, de Rhodes pressed on. What do we owe to a language, not just as a tool of communication, but as a mirror of identity? Can one man, an outsider, truly understand the soul of a people through their words? As the questions grew louder, so did the tension. And soon, Alexander would face more than just skepticism, he would face opposition that threatened to end his work altogether. The early years of Alexandre de Rhodes's mission in Vietnam were filled with quiet battles, against the weight of language, the limits of culture, and the delicate balance between faith and fear. He traveled from village to village, often by foot or boat, under the hot sun and monsoon rains, preaching the gospel to those who would listen. At times, he was welcomed with curiosity. Other times, he was met with silence or suspicion. Still, he kept going. His sermons were not just religious, they were also acts of language. Every word he spoke had to be translated, adjusted, softened, made more human. Vietnamese is a language that sings, it rises, falls, shifts tone. One wrong tone can change the entire meaning of a sentence. Alexander knew this, and he listened closely. Day after day, he sat with locals, learned their songs, watched how they spoke to their children, to their elders, to the heavens. Language was not only something to study, it was something to feel. But as his influence grew, so did the danger. By 1630, only 3 years after his arrival, the Trin lords grew uneasy. Catholicism was spreading quickly, especially among the poor and marginalized. They saw it not only as a foreign religion, but as a threat to traditional Vietnamese authority. Local officials began to pressure the missionaries. Laws were passed banning conversion. Churches were destroyed. Vietnamese converts were punished. And Alexandre de Rhodes was seen as the face of this movement. He was arrested and imprisoned. The cold walls of the prison were damp, dark, and silent. He had no books, no paper, no candles. He did not know how long he would stay. Days blurred into weeks. At night, he prayed, not only for protection, but for strength to continue. And in those long hours of solitude, something inside him shifted. He no longer saw his work as simply converting people. He saw it as preserving something greater, the dignity of human voice. Eventually, he was released, but not forgiven. The Trin lords gave him an ultimatum: leave Vietnam or face execution. With sorrow in his heart, he left the country he had come to love. But he did not give up. He returned to Macau, then spent time in other regions of Asia, Japan, Siam, and Malacca, always hoping for a path back to Vietnam. And he did more than wait. In exile, Alexander began to write. He worked tirelessly on his dictionary, compiling Vietnamese words using the Latin alphabet he had adapted. He created grammar guides, catechisms, and teaching materials, hoping they would one day return to Vietnam. His most famous work, Dictionarium Analyticum Lusitanem et Latinum, published in 1651, was the result of years of passion and perseverance. It became the foundation of Quoc Ngo, the Romanized Vietnamese script still used today. But this written achievement came at a cost. He was never again allowed to return to Vietnam. He had given them a written voice, but he would never again hear it spoken around him. Have you ever poured your soul into something that would outlive you, something you knew you might never see fulfilled? What drives a person to keep creating, even in exile, even in silence? For Alexandre de Rhodes, exile was not the end. It was only the beginning of his greatest contribution. But before his legacy could take root, another storm was gathering, one that would test his purpose in the most painful way. By the early 1640s, Alexandre de Rhodes was back in Rome, far from the humid fields of Vietnam and the gentle rhythm of its language. But in his heart, the mission had never ended. Every day he woke with the same thought: how could he return? How could he continue what he had begun? He carried with him more than just memories. He carried manuscripts, letters, a nearly completed dictionary, and a vision of what Quoc Ngo, the Romanized Vietnamese script, could become. But without permission to return to Vietnam, his dream was suspended, trapped between two worlds. In Rome, he pleaded with church leaders and Jesuit officials. He described the Vietnamese people's hunger for knowledge, their poetic way of speaking, their openness to faith. He showed them how Quoc Ngo could help the gospel reach even the most isolated villages. But the response was cautious. The church was already stretched thin, and many questioned the value of investing further in a land that had expelled its missionaries. Still, Alexander didn't stop. He turned to the one power beyond the church, the French monarchy. At the time, France was rising as a colonial and missionary power. Alexander made an extraordinary decision, one that would mark the turning point of his life. He proposed to King Louis XIV the creation of a French mission to Asia, one led not by Portugal or Spain, but by France. He envisioned an organization that would train priests, send missionaries, and support the spread of Quoc Ngo, not just to convert, but to educate. This proposal was bold, even radical. It signaled a shift from spiritual to political strategy, from Jesuit obedience to national ambition. In doing so, Alexander was risking his place within his own order. But he saw no other path. Vietnam was close to him, but maybe not to France. He helped found the Missions Étrangères de Paris, Paris Foreign Missions Society, which would later play a major role in French involvement in Vietnam, for better and for worse. This was his moment of transformation. No longer just a missionary, he had become a bridge, a man caught between faith and empire, belief and power. But this turning point also marked a great sorrow. Despite his efforts, Alexandre de Rhodes would never again set foot on Vietnamese soil. The land that shaped his life, the people whose language he helped preserve, he would only know them through letters, reports, and memory. His passion had given birth to a script, but it had also pushed him to the edge of two worlds, Europe and Asia, faith and politics, belonging and exile. Still, he pressed on. He completed his dictionary and grammar guide. He published his works in Rome and Paris. His writings began to circulate among future missionaries, scholars, and even colonial agents. The seeds he had planted in Vietnam were now beginning to grow in distant gardens. But at what cost? Was he saving a culture, or shaping it in the image of another? Was Quoc Ngo a gift of literacy, or a tool of control? These questions would echo long after his death, and they still linger in history today. Alexandre de Rhodes believed deeply in the power of language. But language is never neutral. It carries with it stories, symbols, and sometimes, shadows. He had set out to share faith, but he had also opened the door to foreign influence, a legacy both praised and questioned. And yet, for all the controversy, one truth remains: without him, modern Vietnamese writing as we know it may never have existed. He had reached his turning point. But the real test of loyalty, sacrifice, and the true cost of belief was still to come. In the final decade of his life, Alexandre de Rhodes walked a narrow line between devotion and disillusionment. He had given everything, his youth, health, and sense of home, for a mission he believed was sacred. And yet, the world around him was changing. The tension between faith and empire was growing. The spiritual path he had once followed with childlike clarity was now tangled in politics, suspicion, and painful compromise. He never returned to Vietnam, but his heart never left it. While stationed in Persia, modern-day Iran, de Rhodes continued his work, writing letters to church leaders and Catholic supporters in Europe. His tone was no longer the voice of a young man full of hope, but of an elder looking back with both pride and sorrow. His language became more urgent, more reflective. He knew his time was short. Persia was not the mission he had dreamed of. The language was different, the culture distant, the risks unfamiliar. Yet he served there with humility, never turning away from his role, even as his body weakened. In those final years, the memory of Vietnamese voices, so full of tone, so rich in warmth, seemed to echo louder than ever. He wrote of his regrets, not for the trials he faced, but for the work left unfinished. He had trained many missionaries. He had written the first Vietnamese, Portuguese, Latin dictionary. He had helped design the alphabet that would one day free the Vietnamese from the scholarly prison of Chu Nam. But he would never witness the fruit of that labor. He would never see Vietnamese children learn to write their own names in Quoc Ngo. He would never hear a mother read a prayer to her child in her own script. And yet, he accepted this. His sacrifice, in his eyes, was not in vain. Because what he had truly built was not a single church or a simple book. He had helped build a bridge between cultures, between East and West, between sound and symbol. That bridge might be used in ways he never intended. It might one day carry ideas he didn't agree with, or even be claimed by powers he never trusted. But still, it stood. Is it possible to dedicate your life to something that will outgrow you, something that may one day walk beyond your control, yet still carry a piece of your soul? For Alexandre de Rhodes, the answer was yes. In 1660, while serving quietly in Isfahan, Persia, he fell ill. There were no grand crowds, no last sermon, no public farewell. He passed away in silence, far from the land he loved most. He was buried not in Vietnam, not in France, but in the soil of a distant land, a final exile for a man who had always lived between worlds. And yet, his legacy would not rest with him. In the centuries that followed, Quoc Ngo would spread across Vietnam. First among converts, then among scholars, and eventually throughout the country. Long after de Rhodes was gone, Vietnamese revolutionaries, poets, and national leaders would use the script he helped shape, not to submit to foreign ideas, but to declare independence, to write poems of resistance, and to express the soul of a free people. His sacrifice was not simply his exile. It was the deep loneliness of never seeing the dream come true. But his choice, to keep building, even in exile, was what gave that dream its life. And so, from a quiet grave in Persia, a new voice was born. Decades after Alexandre de Rhodes took his final breath in distant Persia, the seeds he had planted in Vietnam began to blossom, slowly at first, then with unstoppable force. The writing system he had helped create, Quoc Ngo, at first remained mostly within the Catholic community. It was used by missionaries to teach the Bible and guide converts, while the majority of Vietnam still relied on Chu Han and Chu Nam, the complex Chinese-influenced scripts used for centuries by scholars and poets. At the time, Quoc Ngo was seen by some as too simple, too foreign, even unworthy of serious thought. But time has a strange way of turning resistance into revolution. By the late 19th century, Quoc Ngo began to spread beyond church walls. Vietnamese reformers, frustrated with colonial control and eager for a modern identity, saw in this new script a powerful tool. It was easier to learn, faster to write, and accessible to the common people. While the French colonists initially encouraged its use for administrative convenience, they had no idea that the very tool they promoted would become a voice of resistance. Writers and poets began publishing in Quoc Ngo, bringing literature to those who had never before held a book. Newspapers were born. Schools taught children not in the ancient scripts of emperors, but in a writing system built on the sounds of their own speech. Vietnamese was no longer hidden behind layers of Chinese characters. It was open, alive, and unmistakably their own. In the 20th century, during the long struggle for independence, Quoc Ngo became the language of revolution. Ho Chi Minh himself, a key figure in Vietnam's fight for freedom, wrote and spoke in it. Political speeches, declarations of independence, underground pamphlets, all were written using the alphabet Alexandre de Rhodes helped develop. The script once intended to spread Christianity had now become a symbol of Vietnamese identity, unity, and resilience. And beyond politics, it transformed daily life. A farmer in the countryside could now read a newspaper. A young girl could write her name without years of study. A nation could record its dreams, its pain, its poetry, in a script that echoed the tones of its native tongue. That, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all, not in converting a people, but in giving them the tools to write their own story. It's easy to forget the person behind the page. Alexandre de Rhodes's name is often remembered as a footnote in history, or as a figure debated for his missionary role. But his work, his resilience, and his vision changed the course of a culture. And his legacy lives every time someone in Vietnam opens a book, writes a letter, or speaks with pride in their mother tongue. Can a true gift outlive its giver? Can someone who dies in silence leave behind a voice that reaches millions? In the case of Alexandre de Rhodes, the answer speaks for itself, clearly, confidently, and in the alphabet of a nation once voiceless, now loud with life. But even as his legacy shines, his story is not without questions. Questions about power, influence, and the true cost of cultural transformation. Today, the name Alexandre de Rhodes is carved on street signs in Vietnam, etched into the history of language, and written, ironically, in the very script he helped create. But his legacy is not simple. It is layered with light and shadow, admiration and debate. Some remember him as a man of faith who brought literacy and learning to a nation. Others question the missionary motives that accompanied his linguistic gift. Was Quoc Ngo a tool of education, or of cultural influence? Was his work an act of service, or the beginning of colonization? These are fair questions, ones that history continues to ask. But whatever your view, one truth remains undeniable: Alexandre de Rhodes gave Vietnam a written voice. And in doing so, he gave millions the chance to read, write, and speak their truth. That is a gift no regime, ruler, or religion can erase. Perhaps the most powerful legacy of all is this: he chose to act, even when he had no guarantee of success. He worked through exile. He created in silence. He believed in something bigger than himself. He may never have imagined that his alphabet would be used one day by poets of protest, or leaders of liberation. But he planted a seed, and trusted the future to carry it forward. And what can we learn from that? That resilience is often quiet. That true impact may come long after we are gone. That words, when chosen with care, can outlive bullets, borders, and time itself. It also reminds us that language is more than grammar and vocabulary. It is memory. It is identity. It is power. And those who shape language, shape the very way people think, dream, and define themselves. So what does it mean to give a voice to others? And what responsibility comes with that? As we reflect on Alexandre de Rhodes's journey, from the narrow streets of Avignon to the far reaches of Vietnam, we see a man who dared to believe that understanding another culture began not with conquest, but with listening. Not with weapons, but with words. And in today's world, Where misunderstanding and division grow louder, his story whispers a timeless truth, that to truly connect, we must first learn to listen, not only with our ears, but with our hearts. But his voice does not end here. In fact, it still echoes in every classroom, every handwritten letter, and every story passed down in the language he helped preserve. Now, one final question remains: how will you use your voice? Let's pause and reflect together. Alexandre de Rhodes' story is not only about history, it's also about learning, perseverance, and the power of communication. And as English learners, there's a lot we can take from his journey. First, let's talk about language. Alexandre de Rhodes understood something very important: language is a bridge. It connects people, cultures, and generations. When he created the Vietnamese Latin alphabet, Quoc Ngo, he made it easier for people to read, write, and share ideas. That's the same reason you're learning English today. By learning a new language, you're not just memorizing words, you're opening doors. You're expanding your world. Second, notice how persistence shaped his life. He didn't succeed right away. He faced rejection. He was exiled. His ideas were not always accepted. But he didn't give up. He believed in his mission, and he kept going. For language learners, that's a powerful lesson. Learning a language is hard. Some days you make mistakes. Some days you feel stuck. But if you keep practicing, reading, writing, listening, speaking, you will improve. Just like Alexandre de Rhodes, your quiet effort will build something lasting. Third, this story teaches us about the power of writing. Alexandre de Rhodes believed that putting thoughts into writing could change the world. And he was right. His dictionary and grammar book helped shape the future of Vietnam. That shows how important it is to practice writing in English. Even short texts, emails, journal entries, stories, can help you express your ideas clearly. Over time, your voice will grow stronger. Let's also look at some useful vocabulary and phrases from this episode. Legacy, what someone leaves behind after they are gone. Exile, being forced to live away from your home country. Missionary, a person sent to spread a religion or belief. Script, a system of writing. Cultural identity, how people define themselves based on their culture, language, and traditions. Try using these words in your own sentences. This will help you remember them and understand them more deeply. And finally, ask yourself this: what do I want my own legacy to be? How can learning English help me connect with others? What small steps can I take each day to improve? Because your story matters too. Just like Alexandre de Rhodes shaped the voice of a nation, you are shaping your own voice right now, word by word, sentence by sentence. So keep going. Keep learning. And never forget, the power to connect, inspire, and transform the world may already be inside you, waiting to be written, spoken, and heard.